Thanks everybody for joining today. We're talking about two topics, one being sort of a bit of a look at the carbon price trends over the last months and year and some commentary around the drivers and where it might go. And then a preview of some new tooling that we're in the process of releasing around planning for your exotic forest in the context of the exotic forestry LUC restrictions, which we released a bunch of analysis tooling for towards the end of last year. Usual story, this is recorded and we'll share it on our website after the session. Your microphone's muted. If you have any questions as we go, this is probably the most important one. Make sure you ask them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And if we don't get to it, then we'll come back with an answer in the transcript on our blog. So as I mentioned before, today's focus, two things, carbon price changes and the drivers behind these. I mean, drivers is always a little bit speculative. There's a lot of column inches that's been printed, like any market, on commentary of what happened and why, and therefore what's going to happen. But this is hopefully some of the sort of less controversial takes. And then, as I mentioned, the sort of actually tracking actions around exotic planting planning on LUC 1 to 6 land and the ETS, and making sure you don't get yourself stuck in a situation you don't want to be in. So kicking off with the carbon price, this is a recent export from EMS TradePoint data, and the period that we're looking at here is from basically start of last year, so January 2025, through to pretty much today. The green line is the one that you want to focus on, and the y-axis on the right-hand side, the other side is EMS TradePoint's traded volume. So a couple of key events here. In the middle of March, the auction failed to clear, so that was completely failed. This was basically created a ceiling on the carbon price for the rest of the year, because essentially everybody in the market knew that they could always get units in fairly large quantities at the auction floor price, which I think at the time was about $64. The timing here doesn't completely match up. I think the auction failed to clear a couple of days before this dip here. There also, I think on the date of the dip, there were some announcements about the LUC restriction policy. In my view, they probably weren't correlated, because if anything, LUC restrictions should drive increased scarcity of units, which should be a signal to push the price up. I don't actually remember what exactly happened on this day or the sort of subsequent period of volatility here through the middle that was really driving uncertainty, but clearly there was sort of this general trend of lack of buy-side market confidence in future unit prices. This sort of turned into an extreme, there was sort of a bit of recovery over the course of the year, a lot of trading in sort of the high 50s. However, in November, there was this announcement from the government that included, among other things, a decoupling in law of the ETS from the NDC. And I won't go into the exact technicalities there, but in a nutshell, and this is just my take on it, there was previously in legislation a requirement that the ETS settings accord with New Zealand's NDC obligations, the NDC being our nationally determined contributions under the, or commitments, I forget which it is, under the Paris Treaty, like how much emissions mitigation New Zealand will achieve itself, whether that's through our domestic efforts or through our international partnerships for sort of achieving climate mitigation outcomes in other countries. This was interpreted really negatively by the market. I don't entirely agree with the interpretation. I think that what changed in terms of the actual implementation was less significant than what obviously the market viewed it as. But in a nutshell, it was interpreted as a lack of commitment from the government to ongoing scarcity of supply of units within the ETS. Like that New Zealand was less committed to its climate change targets than it might previously have been believed to be, and that this would mean that unit prices were going to be even lower in the months ahead. Almost immediately after this came out, various ministers and ministries were sort of pushing quite strong messaging that that wasn't the intention, and that they did remain committed to the sort of New Zealand's climate change targets, and that the ETS would remain a key instrument, and that they were going to push for the ETS as a way for New Zealand to reduce emissions. But obviously this didn't immediately restore confidence in the market. The general sentiment revealed by the price was, we're not convinced. This seems like that the ETS is going to have low prices in the future. This was sort of followed in early January. You sort of see this further, I mean, the slope here is fairly linear, but this continued slump was in part triggered by we got to the end of a mandatory emissions return period. This means that not only do all forest operators in the ETS have to submit a emissions return over the next 6 months between January and June, but some of those who haven't been submitting those returns for the last 3 years will get all 3 years worth of their units at once. So basically this is a supply side trigger that can release more units into the market. And some of these units are from people who need the cash quite quickly. As soon as they get the units, they start selling them in at whatever price they can get. And this creates a further price slump because there's basically a surplus of supply on the market that's possibly a bit of a price taker. It's not waiting for good prices. They need the money right now. The more recent only thing I could really call a major event, even though it was sort of mostly a reiteration of the status quo, but I think it was interpreted by at least some as a positive sign of government commitment in the space, was the publication of some letters between Minister Watt's office and the Climate Change Commission, basically around the ongoing reviews of the ETS settings and things to, so these letters are publicly available online. I haven't repeated them here. In a nutshell, it was especially the minister signalling ongoing commitment to the ETS and including an openness to, or requesting exploration of options, including further limitations of auction supply into the ETS to support pricing and help the ETS be an effective emissions mitigation tool. In a nutshell, at very low prices, the ETS doesn't do a lot to support decarbonisation because it's cheaper just to emit, and it's not that commercially compelling to a forest. We need higher prices for it to be effective as an emissions reduction thing. Since then, the price has trended back up to around where it is today. I think it's currently trading around $45-ish. Again, the correlation between these two events, it looks like they're at least correlated. That doesn't mean that there's a cause behind them. It could just be that this is the really liquid supply on the forest owners who really needed the money right now are sort of dried up a little bit, and the people who are selling are a little bit more selling at their discretion and aren't prepared to sell at $35. They're sort of waiting for better prices. So I mentioned auctions before, and in very broad terms, the reason that the price is low, which is always the question we get, like why is the price low? It's because there's plenty of supply that is prepared to sell into the market at that price. A lot of the people on the buy side of this market, in terms of the emitters who have a compliance obligation, they're mostly just trying to buy at a price that's reasonable versus the market. Like most of the costs get passed on through their costs of product. They essentially don't want to buy too much at too high a price and then be less competitive in the future as a result. The supply side, the general intention of the ETS is that units are something that is relatively scarce, and the government can make units available through the ETS auction mechanism. And one of the things that helps control the price of units is the floor price on the auction. And then there's various cost containment reserves where if the price gets too high, they'll release more units into the market so that the prices don't go out of control. The problem is that the auction volumes are now pretty small in the context of the total market. For some background, the 2022 auctions, I think, sold out completely, as did, I think, the 2021, including all of the cost containment reserves. And since then, it's been a little bit of the auctions have generally not been succeeding. And certainly, I went back as far as December 2024. I think the previous 3 auctions that year all failed to clear. December 2024 was the last time an auction even partially cleared. That was with a floor price of 64. Since then, we've had 5 auctions in a row that have completely failed to clear. And if you look at the floor price on these auctions, which was 68 for last year and has now gone up to 71 for this year, it's no surprise they're failing to clear. The people who might buy at auctions can buy the units for much less in the secondary market, and hence they're doing so. So the question is sort of how much difference does the auction actually make both now and into the future? This data is pulled from MFE's website. It said on the site that it was last updated in 2024, which is a bit of a concern, but I think it's still roughly in line with their forecasts. And you can see that on the supply side, basically on the demand side, got this back to front. Supply side is on the left, demand side is on the right. The supply is how much units are becoming available to the market. You can see there's some auction units, the industrial allocation units, forestry removals, and then other removals, which are things like greenhouse gas destruction techniques that mean you can claim some carbon credits. They're generating sort of 27-ish million tonnes per year of supply. Meanwhile, on the demand side, there's sort of 40-ish million tonnes in aggregate across liquid fossil fuels, stationary energy, waste gases, and then deforestation, which is sort of, so this is total forestry removals, and then forestry removals minus deforestation and harvesting is net forestry removals. This creates a net difference of sort of, under these assumptions, there's about 13 million tonnes a year and declining, which is not met by, that's the imbalance between supply and demand. And if the auctions don't clear, as they didn't last year, then that takes 13.6 up to 18 points or 19.6, all else being equal. So the auctions do change the supply-demand balance by quite a bit, but they're fairly small in the context of total supply, which is why auctions can fail to clear and you just get a bit more demand on the stockpile of units. So this brings us to the stockpile. The stockpile is sort of the key question of why our price is so low, and the answer is that there's a lot of units in comparison to the annual supply-demand imbalance that are still sort of sloshing around out there in privately held units in the market. This is a summary of the privately held units as of the 31st of December 2022. Something to note when you're looking at these reports is that there's sort of some key dates each year which are relevant and lead to sort of quite big changes in the privately held units. One is the end of March, which is the surrender deadline for emitters within the ETS, and the other is the end of June, which is the emissions return submission deadline for forest owners in the ETS for the standard emission reporting cycle each year. So you always have to try and dampen out these seasonal factors when you're looking at the stockpile, which is why I've just compared points in time. Back in end of December 2022, which was the highest value I saw within the record, it was 164 million tonnes in the stockpile. As of the end of last year, that was down to 135. So it's a 30 million tonne drop, but there's still 135 million tonnes left there. Now, there's various different perspectives on how much of that 135 million tonnes is actually available to the market. Like, is some of that stuff that people are holding back because they're going to need it to meet their future forest harvest surrender scenarios, etc. I'm not going to go into detail of what I think is and isn't correct there. There's certainly reports that have been published on this topic. But at the moment, this is the pool that emitters are drawing on when you see this imbalance each year of we've got 40 million tonnes of demand and 27 million tonnes of supply, whereas the rest coming from, to meet the demand, it's coming from this pool. And the sentiments of the people who own the units in this pool has a very big impact on price, because if they're feeling optimistic about future prices, they're less likely to sell, they'll wait, which means that supply goes down, prices go up. If they're feeling pessimistic about the ETS prospects and whether there'll be a lot of demand in the future or a lot of supply, or if the regulatory environment will change, then they might decide to sell their units even at a lower price. In terms of the future drivers for price, this is certainly an incomplete list, but one of the things is how quickly does the economy in general decarbonize, or at least the part that's covered by the ETS. So does demand drop with things like moving away from fossil fuels is probably the key one, or also are there lower, there's a separate point. So it's basically how quickly do we move away from fossil fuels and energy generation and transport including personal transport, freight, air travel, etc. Key to note, domestic air travel is captured by the ETS. Afforestation rates also have a big impact in the long term, a small impact in the short term. If there was sort of 50,000 hectares of forest planted this year, for example, I'm not saying there will be, I think it'll be probably an order of magnitude less than that the way things are going. That won't change the total supply much next year or even the year after, but it does change the forecast of supply for sort of 2030 to 2035 and onwards when those forests start growing quickly, and that changes people's perspectives on how much units might be worth in the future. Other side of that is harvest rates. If the unit prices are high enough, people might choose to even delay harvesting their forest depending on the situation, because they have to potentially surrender carbon units when they harvest. If unit prices are very low, people who had been delaying harvest might choose to harvest more, which will create demand for units and sort of equalize the prices out a little bit. Another key one is just regulatory change and reform. There's been various reforms signaled in the past. I'm sure there'll be more reforms signaled at least in the future. And if, for example, in the past, people have variously said things like, how about if you could no longer use forestry units in the ETS? That would totally change the supply-demand dynamic and totally change the prices. And there's various of these proposals which are of greater and lesser probability, but the market's perspective on how likely they are changes the market price. And then related to what I was mentioning before with the size of the stockpile, any information that it sort of emerges or perspectives that emerge on how much of that stockpile is actually available to be used by emitters rather than, or sort of available to the market to determine the price, rather than being held by various parties basically as a hedge against different things, like what might the price be in the future when I decide to harvest, or what might the price be in the future when I have to meet my liquid fuel emission returns. The perspectives on that availability can influence the price. But probably the biggest one is, in the short term, the sentiment around all of the above, like how much do people think these things are going to happen in the years ahead? Therefore, what do they think units are going to be available for and at what price in the future? Therefore, what should they pay for them now? So what does all of this mean? Key thing to say is, like, we don't know. We are trying to read the tea leaves like everybody else, but it is definitely a tea leaf reading exercise, and those factors I just mentioned are pretty diverse and pretty hard to come up with a definitive it will be X kind of conclusion. The market, the whole point of the market to some degree is that it provides a sort of independent signal on what a unit is worth, and a market currently thinks, having balanced all of these factors, that a unit is worth about $45. There's various commentary around an analysis that suggests that the long-term marginal price of exotic forest carbon units is about $50. So that's the price which has to be in place for someone creating a new exotic forestry unit to decide that it's worth doing. There's various questions there around particularly what time frame you're talking about. Like with the ETS as it's currently set, there's some perspectives that there might be an oversupply of units, like a large oversupply in the late 2030s to 2040s. And then there's other commentary which suggests that there might be a structural shortfall of units over the next 5 years, which could lead to a supply squeeze. But even if there's going to be enough units in the long term, there's not enough in the short term, and that could push prices much higher. $90 being one figure that's thrown around, though I strongly discourage people from like fixating on any of these numbers and going, oh good, well I can rely on that price, because if recent years have shown anything, is that all of this is pretty speculative and there are a lot of factors that can change it. I would just say, though, that these numbers above aren't necessarily inconsistent, because there is a sort of a time aspect to it. It could simultaneously be true that units do get to $90 a tonne towards the end of 2020s, call it 2030, yet they are also in the long term only going to be around $50 by the time we get to sort of the mid-2030s or later. All that being said, for those who are looking at planting new exotic forest, like $45 a tonne is still a lot better than nothing, especially if you're looking to plant the forest anyway. So this ties in with a lot of the discussion we had last year around the new restrictions on ETS registrations for exotic forest and how to work within those for whatever it is that you're looking at doing on your land. So I'll just quickly recap these. The new regulations that are introduced is a ban on registration of forest on LUC 1 to 6 land. But it's not all forest and it's not all LUC 1 to 6 land. There's restricted forest, and then even within restricted forest, there's certain things which you can register. This was the summary. I'm not going to go into any detail on these. If you're interested in learning more, then go back to some of our past webinars. But there's a whole bunch, which means that you're not restricted if you fall into one of these categories, even though you're on LUC 1 to 6 land. And then there's these basically 4 exemptions where even if you are on LUC 1 to 6 land and you are restricted forest, there is a transitional exemption for if you can prove that you had a qualifying forestry investment that was already in process between certain dates. If your application was submitted prior to 31st of October 2025, and I think it's also, if your forest was forest before 31st of October 2025, then it's not restricted, regardless of whether you put an application in or not. Then up to 25% of the LUC 1 to 6 land per individual farm, which is again a lengthy technical definition, which you'll need to be sure of if you want to start working through. So basically see previous webinars for details. And then a permit above and beyond this, which can be applied for LUC 6 land only, of up to 15,000 hectares per year across New Zealand, which people can enter a ballot to get a share of. So late last year, we released these high-level sort of analysis toolings of under these constraints, what might your restrictions and hence your opportunities be on your land? And here you can see this is a particular block, which I'll take a closer look at in a moment on a live demo, where we were saying that there's, of the total farmland, which, oh, I've got it over here, the total farmland is 3,180 hectares. Of that, 2,260 of it is LUC 1 to 6, on the regional level LUC, and hence could be restricted. The remaining 898 is LUC 7 to 8. And so there may be other reasons that you aren't allowed to plant forest there or shouldn't plant there or have some restrictions about that, but at least as far as the ETS is concerned with these new rules, this is not restricted forest. Within the LUC 1 to 6 land, there's also the breakdown of 1 to 5 and 6 matters, because on 6 you can potentially apply for the ballot, 1 to 5 you can't. And then from this you can figure out things like your 25% levels, etc. What we didn't have last year, and we do have now, is how this ties in with what it is that you actually want to do on your farm. So that's what we're sharing today. This is an example of a farm where I've just thrown in, for argument's sake, a whole bunch of intended afforestation, which is this orangey stuff here. And the question is, to what extent, if this is what you wanted to do, would you need to worry about or be limited by these LUC restrictions? Like, are they going to cause you a problem and they stop you from getting the ETS income stream that you might be relying on? So we've shown the planned forest planting stuff before. This is basically just the sequencing of what you're planning to do over time. So in the case of this property, I bring up the live version. There's, one second. We've got roughly 1,100 hectares worth of planned forest lined up in the pipeline. And so this has also been on the platform for some time. But the question this doesn't answer is that a problem or is that okay given these LUC restrictions? That's what this new analytics tool does finally answer. And what it's saying here is that this land has 3,200 hectares in total, which is broken up roughly as we were looking at before. Like, the majority of it is LUC 6 land, there's a fair bit that's LUC 7 to 8, and there's a small patch of LUC 1 to 5. That means that the 25% allowance under the LUC 1 to 6 25% thing is 565 hectares. But as we were just discussing before, the current intended planting is 1,200 hectares. So it exceeds that 25% allowance. And so, is this a problem? We've added in this functionality that for any given area of forest, you can designate how it is that you plan to get that into the ETS. And you'll see that there's included in this category down the bottom, no pathway yet. That means that whoever the user is who's doing the planning hasn't yet said how they think they're going to get this into the ETS. And that's a bit of a red flag, because it's fine if you don't intend to register it in the ETS, but you'd want to be going into that with your eyes wide open, because, as I said before, even $45 a tonne is a lot of money over the lifetime of a new exotic forest. But it could be that you're looking at getting in under any one of these various other categories. So here we can see that there's a certain amount that's intended to use the 25% allowance, a certain amount that is, let me double check what that one there is, stuff that's intended to go in through the LUC 6 ballot, and a certain amount of stuff where it's expected that there will be a transitional exemption. So this was stuff where there's a pre-existing investment that can be demonstrated and it's exempt from the rules. We've also got an indication of the distribution across the land classes by the stage of the forest planting. And then it's these two last bits here, which are really the sanity check of, are you about to get yourself into trouble with what your plans are? The one on the left is how much of your 25% allowance you've used up by the registration status. So we split the registration process into draft, which is sort of you're still in the early planning stage; intended, which is that you plan to register it in the ETS, but you haven't yet; prepared, which is that you're ready to submit it for registration in the ETS; submitted, which means that you have submitted it and it's with MPI for processing; and then finally registered, which is it's now registered in the ETS. All of these things stacked up together, if you start to go over your 565 hectares of allowable 25%, basically you can't do that. You need to find some other way to balance these things out. This is sort of the warning that what you're currently planning to do, you're likely to get into trouble with. There's also another part to the 25% process, which is using the 25% allowance as a backup for your other intended pathways. So if I don't know if that'll actually be any better on the other screen. I'll try and change what I'm sharing just so you can see it a bit more easily. So this bottom graph here on the right, yeah, that should be easier to see. This shows relative to your 25% allowance, what's the result of all of the stuff that you plan to do combined together? Because there's the stuff that you're planning on using the 25% allowance for, but then there's also the stuff that you're planning on another pathway for, but that doesn't mean that that other pathway is going to work out. So in this case, we've got 15 hectares where the user hasn't designated any pathway yet, 267 hectares where they're planning on using the LUC6 ballot process and permit, and another 575 hectares where they're planning on using the transitional exemption. Now, the result of these is, as we were discussing before, the sort of 1,100 hectares total planned afforestation, but that's a lot more than your 565 allowance. That doesn't mean that you can't do it, but it does mean that whether or not you can do it depends on how these different things go. So at the moment, nobody has an LUC6 permit, at least as far as I'm aware, because the LUC6 balloting process hasn't been defined. Also, just because you intend to get a transitional exemption doesn't mean you'll necessarily be granted one. It depends on the strength of your case and how clearly you can demonstrate that the transitional exemption conditions were met. If the result of these things all stacked together was still less than 565 hectares, then you can be a little bit more comfortable because you know that even if you don't get a ballot, and even if your transitional exemption application is rejected, you can still just change your mind and register the forest using the 25% pathway instead. However, what this is showing here for this farm is that if the other pathways don't work out, then you're either going to end up having to change your plans or have a bunch of forests which you can't get recognised in the ETS, which could become very expensive. How this all plays out depends on the nature of the land and the nature of the forest. So I've got here a second example. And this land is, I'll do this with the live version just so you can see that this isn't all just smoke and mirrors. This land, simultaneously, it's a lot easier. I should just say as well, none of this is a commentary on what people should or would or should or could do with their farm necessarily, given other factors. Like, I'm not saying that this is a great place to plant forest. It's just an illustration of how the new regulations apply. But we can see here that a lot of this farm, I'll just tweak the colors to make it a bit more obvious. A lot of this farm is LUC7 and LUC8. And that can mean that it's pretty difficult country to farm, but it's not restricted under these new rules, at least with the regional rules. They've got a much smaller area that's under LUC6. So this is a little bit of a double-edged sword. On the bright side, it means that there's a large area of the farm where you can pretty much do what you want as far as these new restrictions are concerned. But it also means that the area of the farm over which your 25% is calculated, as we see here, is pretty small. So these guys only have 18 hectares worth of LUC 1 to 6 allowance that they can spread across their forest. And what that means is that even a relatively small area on the farm of intended planting, if it happens to coincide with that 1 to 6 classification, as I've indicated here, you can run out real quick. And we see that through here in the stats. The LUC 1 to 6 allowance is only 18 hectares, yet there's 30 hectares which is currently proposed relying on the LUC 6 permit. That's fine if the permit goes through. The problem is if the permit is refused and there wasn't any transitional exemption in place, you can't just fall back on the, oh, well, I'll just use my 25% pathway because your 25% might not be enough. And so this is one of those things where you might want to hold off on the planting until you actually get the permit in place. There's a million different scenarios which could evolve here. There's obviously a whole heap of different exemption categories, some of which are definite and some of which are uncertain, which I haven't talked about. The key point in all of this is that if you don't want to take unnecessary risks, you need to do this analysis and this planning up front. If you don't do the analysis and planning up front, you might get lucky, but you might find that the whole thing sort of explodes in your face and now you've got a lot of forest which you can't realize the full benefit of that you were hoping to realize. I'll try and find my slides back again. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. So those are this is just the same thing again, but not live. those are the tools. There's two things which are still basically not confirmed in terms of process. There's probably some others, but these are the two key ones. First is the LUC6 ballot specifics. To the best of my knowledge, it is not yet defined exactly how you enter an LUC6 ballot, how much it costs, and at which time you do or don't have to pay the money. The expectation, given the legislation, is that there will be 2 ballots this year. So I think basically if you think that you're going to need an LUC6 ballot, watch very carefully for announcements around those. We'll send out email updates when the time comes. But I think you want to be making these plans and exploring these options, especially if you're looking at doing 2026 planting in advance of the first announcements on the ballot, because the ballot rules might not play to what you want and you might not get an allocation. The second thing that's not confirmed is erosion-prone land designation. So there is a carve-out for erosion-prone land under various different names in the legislation, that if, to the extent that your forest is on erosion-prone land, setting aside other restrictions that might exist on whether you can plant that land, you're exempt from these restrictions even if the land is designated as LUC 1 to 6. Issue is that the erosion-prone land isn't just any land that is declared erosion-prone in any data layer. It has to be specifically designated as, I forget the exact term, but it's something like highly erodible land or high risk of land or severe erosion risk land in a regional or a district plan. To our knowledge, that is only true of one district at the moment, and that's the Tairāwhiti district. So Gisborne District Council have a layer in their regional plan which qualifies. We're not aware of any others that exist nationally. If you're involved in a regional or district council and you have a plan that does meet this, please let us know, because we'll incorporate it into our planning tools. And from the feedback we've had, it's also unlikely that any will be added in the next year or so due to the restructures that have been signalled around regional councils. So probably if you are thinking of relying on that pathway in the short term, my recommendation would be don't. In terms of next steps, if this has sort of all got you thinking, oh man, I don't know what to do, what does this mean for me and my farm and my plans? Basically, just make a plan. It may well be that you can still do exactly what you want to do. The thing is just take the risk out of it if you can do so. We're still offering the regional LUC basic analysis for free. The process to get that is, so this is the sort of using high-level regional LUC breakdowns, which gives you a foundation for planning. The process is just to go to that URL. You can also go to, I think we've just called it Lucky, carboncrop.com/lucky. Find your farm, click submit, and then we'll email you a report that looks like this, which gives you the high-level breakdown. And if you want to then go further and use some of the sort of explicit planning tools that I've just shared, and start answering some of all of these other questions, some of these features now exist in the platform. There's more coming still. You might be able to access CarbonCrop through your catchment group. Again, express your interest through that link, and you can mention the catchment group that you're part of, and we'll see if we can get you access to the extra tooling. All right, I'll have to see how questions have come in, but I'll run through the existing questions that we had first. First question was, what impact are the failed government options having on the carbon market? So I covered that in the earlier explanation. I'd say the impact in terms of the overall supply-demand dynamics is, it's definitely real. Like, there are fewer units in the market than there would be if those options had cleared. However, there's not that many units that were going to be available, so they haven't had that dramatic an impact on the reduction in the stockpile and reduction in supply. I will say that one impact that the auctions are currently having is that they're acting as a ceiling on the price. However, we're also nowhere near that ceiling. So the current price, as I mentioned, is about $45. The auction floor for this year under the current rules is $71. So there are obviously many other factors that are meaning people aren't prepared to pay even close to the auction floor price, aside from just merely the fact that the auction floor is there and that they know they could probably get a bunch of units in the next auction for $71. So in a nutshell, the overall oversupply of units in the ETS and the size of the stockpile is the main issue, rather than whether units do or don't clear at auction. And I think that'll remain the case for the next year or two. How do we ever gain certainty on carbon pricing into the future? Yep, the question answers itself, really. I think it is a little bit, it's at least difficult to answer. I guess I'm trying to think of anything that's actually useful to add. Structurally, I'd say the world still has the problem of there's far too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Carbon markets globally are generally increasing in their scope and price and liquidity. New Zealand is to some degree a little bit of an outlier in that it's going. We haven't changed the scope of the market in a while. In fairness, it was already fairly comprehensive. The only thing that's really left out is agriculture. And the price has been falling probably because there was too much supply released in the past. And then there's certain, like, we're very good at creating carbon removals using forestry. It does mean that that combined with regulatory uncertainty does make it very difficult to answer this question with certainty. Depending on the scale that you're at, you can potentially enter into forward contract agreements with emitters who might be willing to, like in the same way that as a forester, you're probably looking at this and going, oh no, how do I gain certainty that the price isn't going to fall through the floor? That's a risk for me. I've got this asset and I'm relying on it performing at a certain level. Emitters have the same question on the other way around. They're like going, how do I gain certainty that the price isn't going to suddenly fly up to $200 a ton and all of my activities are suddenly uneconomic and I'm in deep trouble and my business starts to suffer? The way that both parties can deal with that is by saying, look, we're going to agree between ourselves that we will buy and sell respectively at $60 a ton for the next 10 years, regardless of what happens in the ETS. And then we're balancing the risk. So those contracts do exist and people are making agreements along those lines, though perhaps not at $60 just at the moment. The issue is that the overheads of getting involved in a deal like that are quite high in terms of all of the administrative stuff around legal agreements and security and blah, blah, blah. It tends not to be a realistic option for a small scale forester. So in a nutshell, I don't think it's easy to get certainty. We have said to people for a long time that we've been talking to and about activities on their land is that it's better to view the ETS as a way to help support something that you're interested in doing anyway in terms of your land use change, rather than rely on the ETS for something that you otherwise would not want to get into. How do we start trading carbon credits as an MFI from scratch? This is verbatim. I'm not sure what MFI actually means. If the person who wrote this is on the call, please elaborate. But if you want to trade carbon credits, in terms of technically accessing, you just set up a emissions trading account, which you can do, I think it's still free. And then you need to set up an account with one of the brokerages to let you buy and sell units, where there's several you can talk to. If you're interested, though, in selling units that you already have and you're with us, it's as easy as just sending us an email and telling us that you've got some units that you'd like to sell, and we'll take you through the process. If you want to do it completely independently, you can set up your own brokerage account with one of the brokerages. And then when you want to send your units to that account, you can just ask us to prepare the transaction for you. We don't charge anything for that. And then finally, what is the LUC? LUC is land use classification, and it's a thing that basically goes from sort of super highly ultra productive best land ever at LUC 1 to rocky scree slope scale at LUC 8. And it's intended to be a rough proxy for agricultural flexibility, suitability, adaptability. The lower LUCs, like 1, 2, 3, 4, tend to be really good grazing land or arable land or cropland and similar. And then 5, 6, 7, 8 sort of getting into hill country or borderline mountain country, sheep and beef. It's very coarse. There's a lot of really good farmland that's designated as LUC 6 and 7, but it's a fairly general class. This is at least in the regional plans, but it's a general classification of what kind of land you have. And then the second part of the question, what do I do about a 1981 photograph that stops me getting carbon credits? My interpretation of that is, what do I do about evidence that suggests that my forest is pre-1990 forest and that's stopping me from getting it registered as post-89 forest? The short answer is that it's very difficult under the current framework. You probably can't do much about it unless you have compelling evidence to the contrary that shows that whatever's in that photograph was not forest and that your forest is actually post-89 forest and that you can register it in the ETS. That said, carbon markets are evolving, and it may be that in the years to come there are better incentive frameworks in place for pre-1990 forest, and you could access those markets. But in a nutshell, if the evidence is there that says your forest isn't eligible, and the evidence is correct, or the evidence is like disputable, but you don't have sufficiently compelling evidence to the contrary, then that's how the assessment's going to be made, and you're unlikely to be able to get registered. All right, I will try and bring up the Q&A thing. It's always difficult to do when I'm sharing the screen. It's Q&A. Bex, I don't know if you're still on. Are there any questions in there? No, we've got no open questions. Okay, cool. In that case, we're done. Thank you all very much for your time. We will be back in touch later on in the year with further updates and some further details on the new product features that are coming. But enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.